And I think it's very relevant to go back to the early days in the 1950s, 1960s, when I was hitchhiking a lot and seeing crashes on the highway and had lost friends in high school and college and law school. The chance of being killed then was 5 times greater, at least, than it is today. And I was driven by what I learned about human factors engineering and crashworthiness and vehicle dynamics, brakes, tires. But I was also driven by an emotional intelligence. So what I learned by meeting with a lot of auto engineers privately, we'd get into a cab at Metro Airport in Detroit and go around and around. They'd give me information. They were totally fearful of their careers. And but they had a lot of knowledge in their head, and they didn't have fire in their belly because they were afraid of their careers. And if you don't have a combination of both, it doesn't work. You have to have cognitive content, but you also have to have an emotional drive that turns that cognitive context into a moral issue. And it was a very serious moral issue. Many years later, I stumbled on a bit of wisdom by a philosopher in the Ming Dynasty in China in the 14th century, which is very applicable today. And he said, quote, "To know and not to do is not to know." And we live in a country with huge numbers of solutions or near solutions on the shelf. They're not on the ground because they challenge vested interests, and there's nothing more powerful than a vested interest in technology, unless there's a vested interest in ideas. And that's the democracy gap. And so 3 lessons here that I learned in connecting with the auto industry. We'd go to the auto safety conferences. One is massive self-censorship. They knew, but they didn't dare do because of their careers. Massive self-censorship. I'll give you some examples you won't even believe. At one of the technical safety conferences, the safety engineer for General Motors opposed seatbelts on the grounds that in the collision in a car where you had a seatbelt, the G-forces were so high they would tear out internal organs, your kidneys, livers, and the deceleration process. Well, then I learned that Volvo had seatbelts in the 1950s. And so I said to GM, is the anatomy of Swedes different than the anatomy of Americans? That's how primitive things were in those days. And the airbag was described as a time bomb, ready to go off. This is pre-Takata. And it was the most medieval exchanges. We're not talking here about some newspaper editorial writer. We're talking about technical conferences where the focus was always on the driver. They're not behind the wheel. It never integrated the driver, the highway, and the vehicle. The second personality, you know, there was a ancient Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, who said, character is destiny, and I was bold enough to add, personality is decisive. And the second personality problem was getting along by going along. Massive conformity. Even when they knew that people were going to get killed, that the fix was very simple, they would go along with this nonsense that pervaded the auto companies of trade-offs. Every time you proposed any safety feature, they said, well, you know there are trade-offs. Yeah, and finally I said, yes, there are trade-offs. It's bad for the funeral industry. Then we were up against Ronald Reagan, who was campaigning in Michigan for the presidency against airbags. And he said it restrained people's freedom to have an airbag in the car. Yes, it restrained their freedom to go through a windshield. The conformity was overwhelming. So you had self-censorship and you had conformity. And the last one still occurs today. The massive underinvestment in what is really important in life, and the massive overinvestment in trivia, in hedonism, in executive salaries that are not deserving. This entire proving grounds of the Institute Insurance Institute for Highway Safety is running on a $25 million budget. Look what it's accomplished. That's 2 years' pay for the head of Walmart, whose singular achievement is to make sure that 1 million Walmart workers today make less than Walmart workers made in 1968, adjusted forward for inflation. This is how we spend our money. In other words, there's an inverse relationship with the investment of money in things that are destructive, hedonistic, trivial, gratuitously greedy, compared to the things that are life-saving, life-preserving, and involve the democratization of technology. And what we've learned in the last 50 years in auto safety advances is that we have to apply these lessons to technologies now that are awesomely risky. Biotechnology, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, pharmaceutical technology. They're almost all without any legal or ethical framework to understand their limitations and their risks, not to mention their costs around the world. And this is a good lesson. There's a lot to learn here. The insurance industry has demonstrated what loss prevention is all about. That should be their prime moral mission, to keep claims down and to keep safety advancing. That's the same kind of challenge that they have with artificial intelligence, nanotech, biotech, and the scourge of antibiotic overuse and other overuse of drugs that are leading to resistance, bacterial resistance. So I hope that when you meet people in other technological fields, you can convey some of the structural advances that we've made, and in case they think that their advance is so overwhelmingly difficult to contemplate, leave them with this message. Look how much has been accomplished by Global NCAP and Latin NCAP and Asian NCAP. If you saw the budget, you wouldn't believe it. The lesson basically is this. It's an encouraging lesson, although one would like larger budgets for important tasks. It's always small communities that start the change. Always the small community. A handful of people here, a handful of people there, that are not self-censoring. They are not getting along by going along. And they're not daunted by the fact that they don't have palatial budgets. They are driven by a moral goal, which is the sanctity of life and respect for it all over the world, regardless of national boundaries. And that's one of the missions, of course, of Global NCAP, to stop this stupidity where corporations put their finger to the wind and they say, well, if this country has X regulation and press that's going to expose us, we'll build a safer car. But if this country doesn't have the regulations, will have weak regulations, and the press is not covering it, we'll just sell them cars with higher risk of death and injury. That has to be ended, and I think within 4 or 5 years it will be. So I want to thank you for the award, which requires 3 arms to carry. But then David was always a substantial person. You know. And I wish you well when you go back to your workplace, because again, it's always a few people that start all movements for justice in the world, whether they're human rights, civil rights, democracy, always very few people. I think that should give all of us hope, so we don't simply rationalize our futility by saying, well, who am I? I'm just 1 or 2 people taking on these Goliaths. Who am I? The one phrase I cannot stand from the average people when they come up to me and they say, hi, and I say, hi, and they say, well, I'm a nobody, but, and I say, you're a nobody? Don't you ever say that about yourself. because all human progress starts with the conscience and that emotional intelligence of care. Thank you very much.